All right, awesome. Welcome everyone back to the next session. Really excited to have Dmitry join us. So Dmitry, how you been?
Good. It's been a busy couple of weeks, but I'm excited to be here and being a part of this community involved. So my name is Dmitry. I currently lead developer advocacy at Meta Open Source, and I've been here for almost 4 years now. And before being at Meta, I worked at Salesforce for several years as a lead software engineer, and with all these years of working in somewhat bigger organizations, I wanted to bring this I would call it guidelines, not the rules, over to all of you and share those learnings and those experiences to highlight that it's actually not that complicated. Everything you already know is very much applicable to a bigger organization. So focus on the basics and be confident in your testing expertise. And I hope this whole conference help people to get even more confident in their skills and know what to learn on and what to focus on. Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today. My name is Dmitry Vinnik and I'm a developer advocate at Meta Open Source. Today we'll talk about testing at scale based on my experience working at Salesforce and now at Meta. So without further ado, let's get started. Alrighty, as I mentioned, today we'll talk about testing at scale, learning from my experience working at Salesforce and now at Meta. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Dmitry Vinnik, or go to my website, dvinnik.dev. So first I'd like to introduce myself. What do I actually do? Currently and before, I used to be a lead software engineer at Salesforce. At Salesforce, I particularly focus on Communities Cloud, which is basically like a WordPress for Salesforce, where customers can build websites based on the data. Let's say you are a company that works with hardware and you have some questions, you go to that website built with Salesforce Communities Cloud. And that's what I worked on. Now I currently lead developer advocacy on open source at Meta. And at Meta, I work throughout my journey there with open source and family of apps, Instagram, WhatsApp, and more. And you can find more about the things that we do at Meta here at Meta Open Source website. So please go and check out some of the great projects that came out of Meta Open Source. All right, but let's get back to the talk and let's look at our agenda. And one thing I'll preface everything I talked about is that little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. What it means is that really when you work at a small organization, you have the same problems that you would encounter at bigger organizations. They just become more apparent because of the scale. And so the same, again, applies to companies, small problems, big companies, big problems. But again, it's all the same thing. It comes down to the same issue. It's gap within the teams. Basically, it's miscommunication between engineers, testers, and stakeholders, PMs, customers. And so our goal today is really bridge that gap. That ultimately is the key to scaling your testing infrastructure, testing strategy. And what we'll try to approach it with building this bridge between engineers and testers and the stakeholders so they can all communicate the same language. All right, so today's focus is making sure we focus on quality versus quantity of tests. Come up with this union of engineering and testing and see where we can use it the most. And really show importance of taking responsibilities for testing. So our agenda will be as beginning with working on quality over quantity, then we'll look at basics of testing, and we'll wrap it up with team dynamics and how to make your team more cohesive. So let's take a look at the first part of our agenda, quality versus quantity. Alrighty, so where should we start? Let's talk about life. So in life, and I really like this book by Barbara Ehrenreich, about natural causes. Basically, this idea that the medicine is often about making you live longer, but not necessarily focus on the quality of life. So it's really prioritizing quantity over quality. And that's what you can apply the same learnings from life to your work. Again, I really like this quote is that we've edited years to life, not life to years. It's really all about quality. So let's focus on that, whether it's in life or in testing. So let's play devil's advocate first, though, because one thing is to claim something like that, quality over quantity, but why would we actually prefer quantity in the first place? code coverage. Bad reasons for having a code coverage. You can focus on some metrics, right? We need a particular level of testing to be in place to ship some code. And just for the sake of metrics. It's again, establishing quality metrics of some sort, maybe for performance reviews or whatever else. I like this example of assertion-free testing from Martin Fowler, where basically a company showcased that they had 100% code coverage, but they actually never done assertions at the end of their tests. They've reached the metrics, but really it does nothing. And marketing value, again, to boast that we fully tested the code, but in reality, it's actually not tested. So, what's the problem with quantity though? It's that you can see trees for the forest. You can easily miss real test, legit test failure among all the tests you used to be failing. So, what is code coverage good for though? It's great for finding untested code. But again, your goal should be finding great balance between too many tests and too little tests, too few tests. And what it's called a Goldilocks, it's called, I think, Goldilocks test suite, finding exact balance between the two. So I would always prefer quality over quantity, because if you spend more time maintaining tests than writing code, you defeat the whole purpose. So we have our priorities set that quality is more important than quantity when it comes to testing. How do we improve? What do we do? So we need to go back to the basics. And it brings us to the second part of our agenda, is looking at the basics of tests. And what is at the base of every test strategy? Something you've all seen and hope love, test pyramid. I know it's an idealistic approach, and I'll mention it in a few slides, but at the bottom layer, you have these unit tests. It's just testing a single unit of code. Then you have which are the cheapest to run, they're the fastest, but they give you the least level of confidence in your overall code. Then you have integration tests at combining multiple units and testing how they operate with one another. And then you have end-to-end tests, which are the costliest, the slowest, but they give you the highest level of confidence in your overall system. So with that, I mean, it's simple, right? In reality, it's easier said than done. I've never seen that pyramid in real life to be working well. In reality, you have real test pyramids. It can be ice cream cone, hourglass, or cupcake. Love the naming, don't like it on practice. So with ice cream cone, you actually end up having an inverted pyramid where you have most number of unit tests, end-to-end tests, even more manual tests on top, like an icing on the cake. So the problem there really is that manual testing, you have too much of that. Manual testing is important, but too much of that is not. UI tests or end-to-end tests become overwhelming, and too few unit tests. And unit tests are the key. They give you the feedback, especially developers. So with manual testing, it is important, as I said, exploratory testing, finding new ways the customer can get to a particular bug, usability testing, how user-friendly your app is, and canary testing, right? It's testing how quickly your app can fail. And I love this blue exploratory testing that looks at this particular type of testing much closer. Designing by contract is basically you write your code in a way where the code itself is testing itself, is also another way to approach it. But manual testing cannot be your core testing strategy. You can't regress test your code because continuous delivery that most developer agencies, places, companies rely on, they have testing in multiple places. You can see earlier in the pipeline and later in the pipeline, right? You need to test before you merge, before you build, deploy. And that's why you can't just rely on a person to run those, because you might run the continuous integration maybe thousands of times, even more than that, right? So bridging that gap is to find that testing is very important and working with developers to figure out how to prioritize and take responsibility for this. And this is where we begin bridging the gap, is now to explain it's not someone else's responsibility to test your code, it's everyone's responsibility. So testing continuous delivery, it's the fact that you need to have smoke tests, make sure your code didn't break the app entirely, and regression funnel, where you trigger maybe hundreds of tests to see all the edge cases you might have written for. UI tests, again, they're great, but too many of them is too slow, right? Because in the pyramid, it's important to have in UI tests that the system testing, they're great for system testing, but they're the slowest, they're the costliest. So you can have too many. The reason why we end up with too many UI tests or end-to-end tests is you have test duplication because it's hard to track how the code is written. It seems like it's just a cheap investment, right? You have someone else to write it. You hire a testing team to do it. Developers do development. And you end up with hundreds and thousands of tests that do the same thing over and over again. It's a sunk cost fallacy. You already began to write those tests. Now removing them is too costly. And the fact that, if you test the whole thing, you test the smaller parts of the app, that is not true either. And that brings us to the fact that unit tests, again, they are very important because they give feedback for your team, especially developers. They quickly get the feedback for the app that they're testing. Because feedback is important because most of the time as developers, we spend actually understanding code, not writing new code. And the understanding of the code happens with tests most often. And that brings me to one of the final points I want to make is that invalid failures, this n number of tests you might have that constantly failing, they're causing lack of confidence in your overall app and your testing strategy. Because you can say it's always failing, it's just a flapper. But in reality, you're breaking the most important thing. You're breaking trust in yourself, in your app, in your test strategy, right? It reminds me of sharks because we stop understanding them. We're afraid of them even more, of these flaky tests. But in reality, we need to tackle them. It's this non-deterministic test, not actually knowing why they fail or they fail, on the second run, on the first they're fine, on the third run they're fine, on the fourth they fail again. So you can't really track why they're failing. It's that they keep failing or keep passing all the time. And tests that might be running for too long. It's this type of flaky test that we have to be wary of. And that's why having too many end-to-end tests, and they are often the ones that flag the most, is a dangerous thing. Again, it's very important to trust, especially for testing and quality and testing at scale and a bigger organization, because you might think this flaky test only fails 1% of the time, right? But if you run thousands of tests for thousands of employees, at scale, that becomes an issue really quickly. So how do we build that trust? You have to deal with the flaky tests. You need to categorize them, try to reproduce them, fix them, and remove them. I love deleting tests. I spend more time deleting tests than actually writing them, and that's my favorite thing in the world. And there's a great talk from Richard Branshaw about tests that flake and how to deal with them. And again, dealing with the false negatives is also extremely important. So we kind of look at the ice cream cone. Let's look at the hourglass. Very similar. Too many UI tests or end-to-end tests, few service tests, but at least you have plenty of unit tests. And the reason why it happens is lack of communication. You don't talk as developers to your testers and vice versa. They divide responsibility with testers, write end-to-end tests, and developers unit tests. You end up duplicating the effort. They keep failing, double the effort, if not more. And Cupcake is very similar. You have a bunch of manual testing, lots of end-to-end tests, so also not ideal. And again, the same issue, communication. It really brings us to this pattern that I'm trying to highlight throughout this talk. While I mentioned a couple guidelines, important thing, the main thing is that the thing at scale, at the bigger organizations, compared to the smaller ones, is that every problem becomes more apparent. Lack of communication is very big issue at any size of the organization. But when you have a big organization, a smaller misstep or a failure of a test becomes a problem because it gets run or multiplied by a few folds. But the practices you have, you learn, your knowledge you have, will be very easily applicable at other organizations as well. So really keep this pattern in mind. The communication is the key. Focus on that. Developers and testers are not just about technical. It's about the soft skills as well. And really it brings me to the team dynamic. Have goal alignments. Make sure you talk the same language. Have this direction of pyramid switched where you actually have UI unit tests, integration tests, and only few end-to-end tests for a few core use cases. same language, talk the same language, and potentially have hybrid teams where there's no separation between developers and testers. You're all the same. Everyone does the same job. I really like this example of, I believe, an airline in South Korea years ago. There was an issue where they spoke Korean, and as a result, there was an issue where some flight attendants might have noticed an issue on a plane, but they have not reported it to their superiors because it would have put shame to those superiors, like the pilots and more. And so there were a couple of major accidents at the time. Fortunately, the whole airline, the whole system switched to English, where, regardless of the seniority of a person, we try to communicate the same way we would communicate with a younger person or more senior person, whether it's age or seniority level. And so it really smoothened the communication, and they haven't had accidents like they had before, ever since introducing the same common language, English, for communication. So team understanding is a key. It's making sure that testing and production try to be the same. It's that the entire team owns the test suite, not just testers somewhere own it and developers own the code. Everyone owns it. It's to have this united team that knows their code base and works it. And the customer is the key. It's not your goal as a developer or your goal as a tester being separate. It's you trying to bring the best product to your customer. And that's what's even more important at any company, whether it's big or small. So call to action here is really welcome change, try a new thing, but communication is the key. Respect those basics. Don't be intimidated by a big company. You already have all the skills you need. You just need to apply them at scale. Lead by example. Try to bring over your quality mindset. It would be greatly appreciated. And talk and talk and talk. Communicate, write, discuss issues, bring up the issues. Don't be hesitant over that. And so with that, we'll go to Q&A. But anyways, you can find me on my social channels, my websites, and that's where you can find these slides as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Dmitry, for sharing. I really appreciated that talk, especially talking about the importance of communication in all size organizations, because I think that's so important to address as part of this. And we're going to start with some questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. So our first question is, how would you approach identifying critical paths first, so to ensure core functionality has coverage?
The key is to identify, it largely depends on the organization. If you have a very strict separation between the testers and developers, which is very common, especially in some parts of the world. In North America, I see it's more and more merged. So it's one title for people doing both development and coding. But let's say you're separated. And if you are separated, at least you need to be very clear on who does what. Generally speaking, developers, they would really care about quick iteration of their code, getting feedback quickly, and that's where they will focus on unit tests. And for them, that's the core functionality. Core functionality of a single function they might be working on. Then, of course, integration tests where you have multiple units, multiple functions working. You might have some mocks for databases or some APIs, some fake data. That's what they would care about, especially on that level of, just looking at the product as a small subunits of work. But if you're looking at it more from a systematic approach, where, again, I would hope testers would focus on the most, and that's the key is to have as few of those core use cases as possible. And the way to get there is to actually be the customer. So your tests will reproduce what majority of your customer base might be doing. So to give you a good analogy, if you've ever done Android development and you launch your Android Studio, it will ask you to pick a platform you might be targeting, a version of Android you might be targeting. Right? And it gives you a percentage of how many users are using a particular version of Android. While you might focus on the 10% that might be very old Android version, or like 5% of the most recent one, but the reality majority of your customer base are still that 80 or so percent, and that's where you should focus on. So as a developer, as a tester or developer, you would focus on the core functionality. User logs in, They maybe create an account, and that's all. That's like one of the use cases, like the core principle, the core idea that they will do it on a daily basis. If the sales is your persona, or rather than focusing on edge cases, having them as a part of your core functionality test suite is an overkill. You will spend more time dealing with them, and it will hide and divert time and effort. You would rather focus on the core functionalities. So TLDR, know the persona and know the core use cases for that persona. Try to stay away from those edge cases. A customer logs in with a special password, might be going through reset, and then try to create an account. Good path, good to check maybe for some smoke test that gets triggered asynchronously, but for the core use cases, that's not what the customer genuinely would do.
Awesome. I appreciate that answer. That was really thorough. We're going to go to this question. Is BDD used at Meta? What is Meta's general testing strategy for web?
Everything that you can think of has been tried or used at Meta or Salesforce or Google or any big organization. The way these kind of companies operate, they are a combination of, at least from the ones I've worked at and the ones I know of, they might have coding styles that they adopt, maybe even on a multi-team level. But generally speaking, teams have freedom to choose their own tools. While those tools need to, go through security checks and being verified by the infra team, whatever verifications need to be done. Generally speaking, you try to find the best tool for the right problem. And these kind of big companies, I think one of the reasons why some of them been successful is because they give that freedom rather than having tens of blockers or stakeholders to go through before approving something. You're actually giving freedom of trying a new thing and then going with that. To give an example, one of the things I liked about React is that one of the selling points of that library was you are able to, as they say, build an empire within a larger web app. Meaning you can just, while your app might be built in whatever, you might start creating small components which just React and integrating into the larger app. The same is with tools or principles or ways you do agile. I at my team at one point did Scrum, then we did like Kanban, then we did Scrumban. So that the kind of the way you manage your work as well as you manage the testing, you can do any of that if that's what works for your use case for your team. And it actually introduces this opportunity for people who join with your experience. Let's say you experience in BDD and you join a team that doesn't do it today, you're able to suggest and introduce. And generally speaking, people are happy to try new things because that's an exciting part of our industry, is that new things coming out quickly. We need to try them and see if they are valid or not. But it comes with your skill of learning and knowing how to introduce something and sell it. Because if you just say, let's all move to BDD without showing the benefit, or at least even trying it without considering the learning curve that people need to go through. So if you do all of that and then you suggest, people genuinely would agree to try it out at any big organization.
Yeah, I love that. That idea of always wanting to learn and try and test new things. It's like that. It has the shiny object syndrome. If you've heard of that,
Yeah.
always wanting to do all of the things, but having to find a way to focus that. So I do really appreciate that understanding.
One more thing I'll mention, for example, right at my team that I work with at Salesforce, we introduced Applitools in our testing life cycle. It wasn't something that came down from up there from the top level. It was us who actually tried to experiment with it. We saw the value in it, and as we built infrastructure around running the Applitools tests and showing the results within our already existing testing architecture, it was adopted wider beyond our team. But that's like one of the examples that you are able to introduce and show the benefit, because if it's beneficial for you, it's probably beneficial for others.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we've got time for definitely one more, maybe two. We'll see. Do you use any particular visual or automated tools to help your team understand how all of the testing you have relates to the project overall and how the tests in the suite relate to each other?
Okay, there are lots of moves and turns in this question. Sorry. Okay,
That's
particular
okay.
tool. Understand how this test work. Okay, basically a way to see all the tests and how they work together. The funny part, and it's kind of a running joke for years now, that every big company tries to reinvent the wheel and make it for just working for that. So every company I worked at, which is medium to large size, they would tend to build their own thing because of their own restrictions or because of the data they might be working on. So yes, we did have tools for congregating all the test results in one place. So when you can think of it, I don't know, a good example would be maybe you have Jira and you have a special plugin that also links to a screenshot for the Applitools when the test failure happens as well, but also logs an error that happened while the test was running. Similarly, you would have something custom built for these sort of companies I just mentioned, right? The bigger companies. So there's nothing I would say, they would buy to then integrate, would rather build it themselves. But yes, that's actually the key, is to not just collect the data, but make it actionable. I have in the past used, for a variety of reasons, enterprise tools. I'm not going to be able to advertise them here, but for a variety of things, whether it's like social listening, right, for social engagement, or for checking bugs, or of course I would use CI, continuous integration tools because we, as an open source team, we rely on, let's say, GitHub for the most part, right? And so we would have lots of bots enabled there. GitHub gets better and better in displaying everything in one place. But that's an important point, though. Try to, across your organization as much as possible, try to move to a single tool or a couple tools that everyone uses. While trying out things is great, but the idea should be ultimately to move everyone there, if that's a possibility, right? Because it becomes tricky to train, tricky to have horizontal mobility, meaning if you have a developer or tester in one team, it's hard to move to another team within an organization if there is yet another tool, yet another thing that they work on. But if everyone is using the same infrastructure for displaying, working with test results, that may be one of the reasons why companies like big scale would build their own thing, because then if it's built internally, everyone's supposed to use it because it's been built just for them. It's this idea of dog fooding, right? You kind of you use what you've built, what you created. And so to answer the question, I can't really recommend anything in particular, but usually you would be introduced with, this is a tool, it's been built in here, you would never hear about it outside of this company. But the same idea you would see in the Meta, at Salesforce, you would see elsewhere, you would see some enterprise, because who creates those startups that build these enterprise solutions? So often it's folks who came from big organizations or small organizations, but they've seen it somewhere else and make business out of it. So It all goes around, it all builds on top of each other. So
thanks so much, Dmitry. I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.